Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this presentation on swallow monitoring and conservation. This presentation is going to be presented by Swallow Conservation, which is a nonprofit out of Western Mass, and the Maine Natural History Observatory. My name is Logan Parker, and I'm an ecologist at the Maine Natural History Observatory, or MNHO, and we work on a number of projects related to monitoring and inventorying the flora and fauna that you find here in Maine. We're also one of the partners working on the Maine Bird Atlas, which is kind of connected to some of this swallow monitoring work that we're doing here. So just before we get into this, a little bit of logistics for the meeting itself. We're going to be recording this meeting today, and we're going to be posting it online. So obviously, best behavior in the chat and the video, because it will be up and broadcasted later. And we're not going to have audio going. All the mics are muted for the duration of the talk until, well, actually what we'll be doing is using the chat. So if you have questions throughout the meeting, unless it's something pressing, you'll want to save that for the end. But if it's something, fairly important that you think we need to address right during the meeting, just let us know. So I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll have a little question period at the end. So before I turn things over to Mara, we're just going to talk about some of the projects that we have going in Maine relating to swallows. And these are projects that MNHO is working on. So we have a nest box project that we started a few years ago, focusing on American kestrels, saw-whet owls, and the eastern bluebird. And last year, we added tree swallows to the mix. So while Mara won't be talking a lot about tree swallows in her presentation, we do have resources for folks that are interested in setting up nest boxes or monitoring existing nest boxes for tree swallows. That information can be found on our website, which is listed here at the top. We also partnered with Mara last year and started a pilot project for cliff swallow colony monitoring. And we have some artificial cliff swallow nests that can be used at existing and historic cliff swallow sites. And so we are looking for folks that can set those up and monitor those for us. We have some of those available still. And we are also working on the Maine Bird Atlas project, which is a multi-year effort. We're now entering our 4th year working on that project, and it's a massive citizen science effort. We're looking for folks to collect records during the breeding season and wintering records during winter. And certainly there's lots of opportunities to collect observations of swallows in the summertime. So there's information there if you would like to become a volunteer and become more involved in that project. There's many ways you can contribute, and we're looking for people of all experience levels to participate in that project. So the presenter today will be Mara Silver. She is a ecologist, I would say, working on swallow conservation down in Western Mass, but she partners with projects all around the Northeast. She's got nearly 3 decades, or maybe, is it now 3 decades, Mara, of experience?
Yeah.
3 decades of experience working on swallow monitoring and conservation, primarily focusing on cliff swallow, barn swallow, and bank swallow. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes, excellent. So she's doing some really innovative things in the work that she's doing using those artificial nests that we talked about, and she has a lot of knowledge about swallows here in the Northeast, and looking forward to learning from her myself. So I'll turn it over to you, Mara.
Okay, thanks, Logan. I'm going to share my screen now. Just 1 second. Can everyone see the 4 different birds on the screen? Okay, well, I just want to thank everybody for coming virtually, and thank Logan and Glenn for inviting me. It's kind of nice to be back in touch with people from Maine. I actually went to College of the Atlantic with Glenn and hadn't been in touch with him. So it was just really nice to be contacted by him and Logan and to see their enthusiasm and interest in swallows. So I'm going to start my presentation just talking a little bit more broadly about swallows. They are what's called an aerial insectivore. And that group is comprised of 4 subgroups. There are the swallows, which is the barn swallow you see on the screen, swifts. There's also a chimney swift on the top right. Nightjars, and there's a common nighthawk on the bottom left, and flycatchers, and that's a least flycatcher on the bottom right. And these birds are all characterized by their feeding habit of catching insects while in flight, thus aerial insectivore. Okay, next slide. So to break that out further to the 6 species of swallow that we find nesting in the Northeast, I'm going to go from upper left across and then bottom row, that we have the cliff swallow with the white forehead, barn swallow, tree swallow. Those 3 are the 3 you're most likely to encounter or recognize. They're common in open agricultural areas. There's also the bank swallow, which is bottom left, and the rough-winged swallow, and the purple martin, which is really pretty uncommon in Massachusetts, and I believe in Maine too, with very localized spots where purple martins breed. These birds, these images are not to size, so like the bank swallow is half the size of the purple martin probably, just so you know. But you can see they're really, they're made for flight. They've got these long, sleek bodies and very short legs, longish wings, very aerodynamic. So the 2 species I focus on, I do work with bank swallows. I did my graduate work on them, but I'm going to talk mostly tonight about cliff swallows and barn swallows. And the upper left is your cliff swallow, and bottom right is barn swallow. We'll get into cliff swallows first. So these birds, both cliff and barn swallows, actually all of our swallows are what's known as neotropical migrants. So they breed in the northern hemisphere, the New World northern hemisphere, and winter in the southern hemisphere. So the blue is for the cliff swallow. They exclusively go down to South America. And what's interesting about their winter range is you see this big blue blob, and that doesn't mean that they're everywhere within that blob. That just encompasses all the areas that they've ever been sighted. But the actual spots where they overwinter it's much smaller. That's just where they've been seen. But they have they're wide distribution of in North America, and they are strictly America's species, unlike barn swallows. So cliff swallows are very colonial, and they nest abutting each other, as you can see here. This is a colony. They're colonial in that they nest. They are very social. Their breeding activity is highly synchronized. We have smaller colonies here in the East. Out West, you can get colonies of thousands of pairs, and the nests tend to abut each other like you see in this photograph. And they build their nests, which are, they're a cavity nester, and they make their own cavity, unlike, say, a tree swallow that uses a cavity that's already made. And they do that by building a mud bottle, one little pellet of mud at a time, which you can see here. So when it's complete, this is what a nest looks like after it was taken down after the end of the breeding season. And you can see each little mud pellet there in the entrance hole. And that's what it looks like on the inside. So they do add some little pieces of fine grass, and they do all of this nest building activity as a group. So their nesting timing is highly synchronized within a colony. So there's hence the name cliff swallow. Out west, you see, cliffs like, you see colonies on cliffs like this. You don't see this here in the north, in the east. But that is why they're called cliff swallows. And again, you can see how colonial they are. So how did cliff swallows become common in the east? They have an interesting history in the eastern part of the country. They were probably here in much smaller numbers than they were in, say, the mid 1800s. They've been declining, so we're kind of getting back to lower numbers. But when land was cleared in the east in the 1700s by settlers, we had a huge land clearing operation that went on and created these open areas. And then the buildings that were put in the landscape must have looked enough like cliffs for swallows to really move eastward in great numbers. And cliff swallows probably reached a peak in the Northeast between about 1840 and 1860. So this is what you see in the East. I know there are some natural colonies in some spots, but they're really uncommon. I think I've seen cliff swallows nesting in Bar Harbor, but it's been a long time. And I don't know of any any sites that are, natural nesting sites in Massachusetts. They're pretty much restricted to buildings or under bridges. Speaking of bridges, what's interesting too about cliff swallows is out west, they're very common under bridges and in culverts, and you see them in that situation really frequently. And for some reason in the east, they don't tend to nest under bridges. Not to say that they don't, but it's not a common thing to see them, and they never have commonly done that like they do out west. So this is just a summer distribution map to give you a sense of where they are in the US and Canada, North America during the breeding season. The darker areas are where they're more common. So you can see the east is lighter. And the barn swallow we're going to move on to, you can see the barn swallow is, barn swallows sort of came on my radar in about 2010, and you'll learn more about why in a little bit. Barn swallows are the most aerodynamic flyers of the swallows. And it's not that they fly faster, but they have these very long tail streamers that help in their maneuvering. So they can make really tight turns that make them look like they're flying faster. But they are pretty amazing flyers. And barn swallows nest in barns, as you might expect. And similar to cliff swallows, they benefited by the human changes to the landscape. So they, before buildings were here, we had they nested in caves, maybe in some large trees, but they were not as common as they are now. There are two barn swallow nests here. I try to use my own photographs, and I'm not as good a photographer as Logan, but I'm trying. But you can see they have a cup-shaped nest, and their nests are also made of mud like the cliff swallow, but their nests are inside barns as opposed to outside, under the eaves. They're inside, tend to be close to the ceiling, and they're cup-shaped. So here's the distribution map for the barn swallow. Similar to cliff swallow, they're gone. When winter comes, they fly to Central and South America. So what's interesting about barn swallows is cliff swallows are actually increasing in certain areas of North America. Barn swallows are pretty much declining in about 90% of North America. But barn swallows have a global distribution. There are different subspecies, but there are barn swallows in Europe and in Asia. And so it's kind of interesting to look at conservation on different scales. You sort of need to take in the range of the species when thinking about conservation. And here's the summer distribution map, a little bit different than the cliff swallow. They're a little more common in the eastern part of the country than the cliff swallow. So I have 3 sections of this presentation, and I hope I keep you engaged through all of them. The beginning is just to tell you how I got into swallows, because I think it's interesting, because I always think some of us bird people, we get stuck on we find our species, and it's just always interesting to know how it happened. So I was originally interested in seabirds, having gone to College of the Atlantic, but then I had moved to Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, and was sort of floundering around after college. And I moved into a house that had cliff swallows nesting on it. And you can see here this little nest that you see. There are 2 white dots. Those are the heads of the adult cliff swallows, a pair of cliff swallows. And it was in the process of being made there. It's not quite a bottle yet, but I was watching this colony of about 21 pairs, and I pretty quickly noticed that it was all the nests were being taken over by house sparrows, which are a non-native introduced species. So they were brought here in the 1850s. And probably if any of you manage bluebird trails or, try to get tree swallows in boxes, these house sparrows are often a big problem. They just are so aggressive. Problem with house sparrows is they don't just take over one box or one nest. They defend like a huge area around their nest, so they're just not peaceful coexisters, and they're just aggressive. And they took over. They basically took over the whole colony, except for my little nest, which fell with chicks in it. And I saw the chicks on the ground, and I looked up and I thought, what am I going to do with these chicks? This is the only nest left on the whole house. And so I took a box and I took it apart. I pulled it apart and put the chicks up on this little platform and put some cardboard around it and just hoped the parents would come back. And they did. They built a nest inside it, which was really exciting. I was just like thrilled. And the chicks fledged, and I was just suddenly like, okay, this is an interesting bird. Is this, I started wondering, is this happening to cliff swallows everywhere? Like, how can there be any if they're all like knocked down by, their nests are knocked down by taken over by house sparrows, falling. And so I called the state ornithologist, and he said, it's a big problem. I don't know what's going on with cliff swallows. Why don't you apply for a grant? I'll help you get some money. You can do some research. And it just kind of happened. And it was also serendipitous that right at that time that I was getting interested in cliff swallows, there was a farm not more than 20 minutes from where I lived that had once been the largest cliff swallow colony in the state. And it was called Graves Farm, and the farmers who owned it had just donated it to Mass Audubon. So it was just like meant to be, because I got permission from the farmers who were birders to observe their colony and try to see if the same things that I saw happening at my house were happening at this farm, and try to intervene and see if I could help the situation. It was just kind of feeling it out. So this is what the farm looked like. And John and Dwight Graves are long gone, but they were really keen naturalists. And actually their observations were written up in some books on birds in Massachusetts from the 30s. So they were really excited to have me there, even though they were very shy. But this is the farm. So this is in the early 90s. Mass Audubon actually took down part of the barn, actually the major part of the barn, but they left this barn, which was where the majority of the cliff swallows, where all the cliff swallows nested and where the barn swallows nested. So it was okay. The first thing I noticed when I started observing this colony, that was my goal, was just to observe the colony and see if what I saw at my house was happening here. And so 6 pairs of swallows showed up, and this is actually a photograph from that time, and they're collecting mud in this. It was a wet meadow behind the farm. 6 pairs showed up, and they started building nests. So this is under the eaves. But before I knew it, the nests were falling. And again, chicks on the ground, and house sparrows, and knocking the nest down, because when they stuff them with grass, they tend to fall down. And so I had implemented at that point a house sparrow control program that I can, if anyone wants to know about it, they can contact me through my website. I don't want to talk about that. It was hard. It's really hard to get rid of house sparrows, but I did do it. And it's, you have to realize that you may only need to, everyone can hear me, I hope.
Yeah, you were muted
Okay.
for a moment, but you're back on.
I thought I started mentioning like killing house sparrows and I got muted.
No.
No, it's illegal to move them. It's legal to kill them. It's really a hard problem for me, but house sparrows were just like decimating this colony of 6 pairs. So nest falling, house sparrows, taking over nests it was the same situation I saw at my house. But what I did was, along with house sparrow control, I made some little clay nest supports. And if you can see the part that's not as textured is actually one of my little supports. And one pair made it that year, and it was the pair that I put up in one of my nests. And you can see this is after the nesting season, so I was kind of proud of myself. The house sparrow control continued. There were a lot of house sparrows at Graves Farm. Unfortunately, house sparrows are really common on farms because they're attracted to the grain. And so cliff swallows are particularly hit hard by them. Another thing I decided to do was in 92, the next year, I decided, okay, I've controlled house sparrows and I'm going to enhance the mud supply, because their mud supply was sort of, I thought, well, maybe if I add clay to the mud, the nest will adhere better to the eave. So I got lots of clay and I made this very sticky mud puddle. And simply by making a bigger mud puddle, I got 30 pairs in 1992. I can't think of anything else that would have changed, nothing else changed to attract that many pairs, because they obviously weren't raised there. So that was really exciting to see. I still had problems I hadn't gotten rid of all the house sparrows. So I lost about half the colony to house sparrows, and I still had nests falling. So the clay didn't help. The clay helped the structural integrity of the nest itself, but the nest, it was the surface of adhesion. They would just fall clean off the eave. And so I experimented with a little tiny fired ledge. I called it a nest ledge, to see if, even with just a nest ledge, they could kind of complete the rest of it if the nest wouldn't fall. And it didn't. I actually have a picture of, they had added on to that, and they actually produced chicks. So I had about 8 successful pairs in 92. And then in 93, I decided to put up 150 of these fired clay nest ledges so that they could complete them and their nests wouldn't fall. So this is something I designed. It had a flat edge to be against the rafters and these rubber kind of bumpers, so I didn't crack the nest. And then I got 63 pairs. And I had pretty much solved the house sparrow problem. So that was like my really good year. And it was clear that nest falling, house sparrows, and the addition of mud, getting rid of the house sparrows, putting up the nest ledges, and the addition of mud really made all the difference. From 93 to 2009, there were about 20 to 40 pairs per year at the farm. And it was really nice. I just spent my summers there basically, and monitored the colony, and I kept the mud puddle going. It kind of became a little wetland back there. So I would sort of, make some wet areas for the tadpoles and some muddy areas for the cliff swallows, and it was pretty nice. I learned later that I think the fluctuation in numbers, because I had that year of 63 and then it kept going down and then it would go up. And upon doing some research, I think there's a ectoparasite called a swallow bug that's specific to cliff swallows. And they build up. This is a photograph. If you can see those little bugs, this is after a nest has been taken down. They're a blood-sucking ectoparasite. They're like a bed bug. And I think they build up in colonies, and when they get to be when there's a certain number, critical level of them, cliff swallows will avoid the site. So I think my cliff swallows, because I didn't know about this till later. I mean, I was noticing there were bugs, but I didn't realize the extent to which cliff swallows avoid them. But that was something I learned later. So we'll talk about barn swallows at Graves Farm. I was not originally focused on barn swallows, but I became focused on them at Graves Farm. They were there. They would fly in the upper windows. If you see those upper windows on the barn, that was where they went, and they nested in there. And there were always about, I would guess there were about 6 to 8 pairs nesting there every year. And mind you, in the book, there's a book called Birds of the Connecticut Valley in Massachusetts by Bag and Elliott, and Graves Farm is called a swallow mecca in there. So something about the configuration of the landscape and this building and the fact that they probably never used any chemicals at this farm, it just was very, the swallows were really numerous here. But the buildings were not part of Mass Audubon sold the buildings, and in the deed it said that there was an allowance for the cliff swallows, but not the barn swallows. So in 2010, the owners of the barn shut that window, put new windows in, and no matter how much I begged, they wouldn't open them. And it was really a bummer, because the barn swallows were actually landing outside that window, trying to get in. You can see one in the upper left. It just is amazing. Just close a window and you're done. They couldn't get in. This is not to put Mass Audubon down, but they also weren't keeping the fields open. So Graves Farm was growing in a little bit, which is not ideal for swallow foraging. And then my puddle was designated a wetland, and I wasn't allowed to make mud there. And it was really, really upsetting to me, because I had been there I was doing this for almost 20 years there. So I had to leave, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then I remembered that my parents had a farm. My parents were originally from New York, but they moved to Shelburne, Mass in 1968. And back in the hippie days, they bought a farm with some other couples and brought us kids up there. And I just decided, hey, I'll go up there and at least see if I can see what's going on with the barn swallows. You know, I knew the barn swallows were there when I was little, and they hadn't been. So I moved up there. And I just observed in 2011, and again, you know, 1 pair of barn swallows, no cliff swallows. There had never been cliff swallows at this farm. The farmer who lived here was also a naturalist and wrote up, you know, had kept records of the birds in the area, and has actually a published author. And I talked to him, and he said, no, there were never cliff swallows up there. So in 2012, I thought, all right, no more ledges. I want to get cliff swallows up here. So I'm going to make complete nests, because both cliff and barn swallows are highly attracted to previous year's nests. So using my ceramic skills, you can see here, this is me making them at home, and then they're fired. So they're like bisqueware, if you're familiar with ceramics. They're like dishes that haven't been glazed, so they last forever. So then you can see I tried to really mimic the shape of the natural nests. And the little tabs for them are on the side, and I put them under the eaves. And I played the calls of cliff swallows. I thought I had to have some high-tech equipment, but I talked to Steve Kress, who does Project Puffin, and he's like, oh, just use a boombox and make it about as loud as you would hear them outside. And I was like, okay. So I did that, and I plugged the iPhone into this boombox, and I made a puddle. And as you can see, so Patten Hill is this is called Patten Hill. It's top of a mountain. It's not a wet meadow. So this was a little bit more work than Graves Farm, but there is a well in the barnyard, and I now have a pump. So I actually maintain this puddle, but this was the early days of my puddle. But I got one pair of cliff swallows that showed up in 2012, and they didn't build. It's kind of funny. I made a little, of all the nests I put up, this one was to the side, and it was like a little starter, and they actually built on top of it. And those little heads you see sticking out are nestlings. So that was really exciting. I had actually attracted them to a site where they never had nested. So I was pretty happy about that. The enhanced mud puddle also increased the numbers of barn swallows from 1 to 3 pairs. And I'm going to condense the next few years. I opened up, what I did for the barn swallows was that they're not in the hayloft of the big barn, but I opened up the stanchion area because it's nice and cool in there. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how heat and potentially climate change is affecting swallows. But one thing about hot summers is that it gets really hot for a bird that's nesting near the roof of a building. So my swallows are nesting in this lower, cooler stanchion area. So I'm going to just say from 2013 till today, I maintained my mud puddle. I had cliff swallows. I have barn swallows. These are barn swallows. These are chicks at Patten Hill. And I actually started making artificial barn swallow nests. So the smooth part of this nest is what I made, and the rough part is what they added. And you can see little chick beaks. And this was to maybe, I do get people saying, oh, barn swallows are nesting in my garage right above my car. Is there any way to get them to, nest somewhere else? I was trying to figure out ways to get them to maybe be in certain parts of a garage where they didn't bother people, but they do what they want. They really do. But I still put these up just for fun. And here you have a cliff swallow. And you can see again the smooth part of my nest and then the rough part that they added. And I like this photograph because a professional photographer took it. So it's just better quality, but you can really see how beautiful these birds are up close. So this was at the height of my cliff swallows at Patten Hill, which was actually about 5 years ago. I had about 9 pairs. And this graph shows what the populations did at Patten Hill from the time I started working there until today. So the barn swallows have very slowly increased. The cliff swallows showed up and then disappeared. So I'm not sure why, but based on what I observed at Patten Hill and what I've observed at other sites where I've put up and tried to attract cliff swallows to places they've never nested, they will check them out, but they don't stay. At Patten Hill they did, but then they left and they nest down at the bottom of the mountain. And my guess, this is purely conjecture, Patten Hill is at the top of a mountain and it's really quite windy up there. And cliff swallows feed on swarming insects that rise on thermals. And I'm wondering if the food availability isn't quite what they need. So there may be things, even though a site looks really fabulous to us, like, oh, there should be cliff swallows here. There's open fields, there's a barn, there's mud. There might be certain weather patterns or, local conditions that are not conducive to their nesting that we can't detect. So I've stopped wasting energy on that. So part 3 is sort of branching out from what I learned at Patten Hill and at Graves Farm. And I also have had more people reach out to me like Logan because cliff swallows are declining quite rapidly in the Northeast to the point where conservationists are getting concerned. So I've had support from the state ornithologist here in Massachusetts to try to attract cliff swallows to build up colonies in the state. And I've been worked with the Canadian Wildlife Service and with New Hampshire Fish and Game, and some other groups, some land trusts here in Massachusetts, to try to help colonies like I have at Patten Hill and Graves Farm to use some of these management techniques. So here we have the cliff swallow nests, and there are also some barn swallow nests that I made, then I fired. And I have made dozens of these things, and it would be nice to have something. I'd hand build each one. So it's kind of nice because each one's unique, but it's also really time consuming, and I'm trying to figure out a way to get them made quicker. So at News, when I branched out, you know, this again, the upper left is in Canada, and there was a guy who works for the Canadian Wildlife Service who was trying to attract cliff swallows to this building that was close to another building where they nested, where people didn't want them. And he thought, well, you know, if we put up nests, will you give, you know, he bought nests, and he made a little mud area, but they didn't move there. So that again tells me, you know, there may be something we don't know that they know about where they want to be. The other three photographs are at sites where cliff swallows were already nesting, but the colonies were dwindling. So these artificial nests I make are really good for sites that are already either are small, you know, are historic sites that have, you know, dwindled to just a few pairs, or have recently been abandoned, or are doing well and you just want to put them up to help the swallows. Because these swallows, you got to remember, on a tight energy budget, they come from South America, and they are here for very few short months to raise one brood. In the case of cliff swallows, they only have one brood of chicks, and then they leave. And so it's much easier for them to use a nest that's already made than to build one from scratch. These are for a site in Massachusetts where we realized it was a little more efficient to attach the nests 3 to a board to put them up. This is that site in Row. Here's an example of the ideal spot to do cliff swallow management. So this is a site that naturally has cliff swallows. This is in the center of Row, Mass. This is Western Mass. It's on the town hall. And there were 6 pairs in 2017, and that there are now 42 pairs. It just has been growing, and it's not just the birds produced there. Birds are being attracted to this site, I think, through the nests, the artificial nests, and through there's a mud enhancement situation going on. And it's really nice because the Row is a town small, is a really small town, and the chief of police is actually the one who manages this colony. So he doesn't let anybody do anything to it, and he helps monitor it and clean the nests at the end of the season. So you can see on the right the little heads in each nest, and then they build onto them to create the opening they want, and they actually add a lot of mud inside as well. Once you take them down, you can see that. This year we also tried to attract cliff swallows under bridges. So there was really no way to get under there without a snooper truck, which I couldn't arrange. So I actually hired a rock climber, and it was pretty exciting to see him putting these nests under. This is a bridge in Massachusetts where cliff swallows nest. And we just wanted to kind of give them a boost again, because we're down to 15 colonies left in the state. And this is another bridge where we put them up, and they use them. If you can see, there's like mud added to some of them. I hope you can see that. And like a little head maybe sticking out in the front. So that was really exciting to see them actually use these under the bridges. And you can't really tell in the picture, but they're a little roof. There's like an overhang over them. It's all experimentation. And again, the hope here is that the birds will do well and expand outward so that we don't have this continual retraction in the number of breeding pairs at these sites. So my work this past season, I had a good grant this past season, and there are 5 salient points that I kind of suspected, but I think the decades of my work and then observations this year of all the colonies in the state, it's really important to remember that cliff swallows are colonial. So there are 15 colonies in the state of Massachusetts that we've detected. And it's interesting to note that the 2 largest colonies accounted for almost half of all of the breeding cliff swallows in the state. So, you know, one of them, the largest one, has house sparrows. So boy, if it were a little one, it wouldn't be such a problem, but we're gonna really try to deal with the house sparrows at that colony. That would be a priority. There were house sparrows present at 9 of the 15 colonies that we found. And like I said, house sparrows reduce breeding success by over 50% most all the time. Another issue for swallows is cliff swallows is the ectoparasite. And I deal with that by taking nests down and washing them. There's a researcher in Nebraska who actually sprays. He's done a lot of experiments. He's like the king of cliff swallows, and he publishes a lot. His name's Charles Brown, but he has done experiments with spraying nests with an insecticide, which I haven't done because I'm not sure how I feel about it. But it makes a huge difference in the health of the nestlings, at least in the short term. And cliff swallows actively avoid sites with high ectoparasite loads. So the cliff swallows assess the sites. So my takeaway is that you want to try doing management. The most efficient use of effort is to put the artificial nests up at historically used sites that have no house sparrows, or make sure you get rid of the house sparrows. Create a mud source, and then cleaning the nests of taking them down, and I do like a light bleach solution. The bugs can live in the wood and overwinter in the wood that of the eaves. So you have to kind of scrub them. And I do that. And I think it knocks them back. This is a lot of work, but conservation isn't always easy. But I think it seems like a very small message based on all this time doing this, but we didn't know. And at this point, people are looking for this information, like, New Hampshire Audubon is looking into trying to save their last few cliff swallow colonies, and they need to look at some of these techniques and whatever else they can find to try to do that, because the numbers are getting so low. So just to talk a little bit about habitat and causes of declines. And one thing I do want to mention is a lot of people say to me, I get the question, well, if their populations were increased by, anthropogenic changes to the landscape, maybe aren't they just retracting back to their original natural levels? And I understand that question, and it makes sense, the question, but my answer to that is that the issue is that there are things beyond habitat. So if it was just a habitat issue, that would make sense. Like, okay, they're going back to their natural site, the natural conditions where they nested, the natural numbers, maybe they'll go back to cliffs or, but it's beyond habitat now. It's things like climate change and pesticide use and unknown factors. There's perfectly good cliff swallow and barn swallow habitat going unused. So in my view, let's conserve the habitat piece of it, because if we can, which we can, because those larger factors are so hard to deal with, and we're not dealing with them very well politically. So, anyway, I'm going to first talk about the habitat piece. So, like I said, land was cleared in the 1700s, and these farmland, these farms were built that created this, mimic the cliffs for the cliff swallows. But now this is the same site in Petersham, Mass. You can see it's gone to forest, and that's good habitat for something else, but not for swallows. And there's just the fact of the decline of agriculture. We all know about that. This building actually had cliff swallows on it in the 60s. Just want to put a word in about barn. I get a lot of questions about barn swallows are listed as threatened in Canada, and Canada is doing a lot of work trying to make these artificial structures for them. And it's a really feel good idea, and it would be great if it worked, but in fact, these little kiosk type structures rarely host more than one or two birds, and often they don't, one or two pairs, and often they don't host any. So I like to say, sometimes a barn has to come down. And I understand financially people can't save all barns, but barn swallows do better in bigger barns. You find larger colonies in larger barns. They're more thermally stable. So barn swallows, aerial insectivores are very sensitive to weather because their food source is, if it's chilly, if we get long wet, cold periods of weather, the insect levels are suppressed and these birds can actually starve. And with, more unpredictable weather, if they have, at least more stable temperatures in their nesting area, that's a benefit to them, meaning that, so when it's colder, when it's in a bigger barn or a bigger structure, when it's cold outside, it's going to be warmer in the barn than it would be in a little kiosk. And likewise, when it gets really hot, it's going to be cooler in the barn. So, going from small scale agriculture to intensive agriculture has not been good for swallows. So insects tend to congregate along hedgerows, and they do well with livestock. Livestock actually increases numbers of insects, but on these larger scale farms with just, I have a slide coming, with this kind of situation is not conducive to swallows. Suburbanization. So this is an area near where I work that was a farm, and slowly over the years, I saw this happen, which is fine. People need to live places, but it's just, you've got to think about what's happening to swallows along the way in my book. So that was kind of interesting to see this just become lawns and pools and no longer like a buggy agricultural field. And that happening on a large scale causes declines. Loss of wetlands. These are just amazing bug factories for aerial insectivores. So here, I just want to throw this slide in for you. This is fairly recent. So if you look at groups of different types of birds, so these are like guilds of birds. The pink is aerial insectivores. So they're getting a lot of attention now from conservationists, like I said. And this is just to kind of, again, bring home the point that there's something going on with insect eating birds. And it's kind of a mystery. This is just some numbers for you. I'm based in Massachusetts. We have about half the swallows of cliff swallows that we had here in '85. I think it's actually down even more than that since I created this slide. And barn swallows are doing not much better. So you think about just since the 80s, half. This is just to show, this is the breeding bird survey. I'm sorry, not the breeding bird survey, that's USGS. This is the breeding bird atlas that Mass Audubon does. And this is just to, the dark green is where cliff swallows were nesting during the survey period. Dark green is where they were nesting. Middle green is probable, and light green is possible, and white is not nesting. So that's pretty sparse as it is, but then you go to breeding bird survey 2, and you can see there's just many less squares filled in. And with barn swallow, it's pretty good in the 70s. If you see all that dark green, that's confirmed breeding. But then you go to breeding bird survey 2, and yes, it's still filled in, but there's a lot less confirmed breeding. So people were seeing barn swallows, but they may not have necessarily been confirmed breeding. And this is bank swallow. So again, confirmed is dark green, probable is middle green, and possible is light green. And then this is breeding bird survey 2. And meanwhile, now we're at 2020. So this is already like 10 years ago. So it's just concerning, I think, for us, aerial insectivore aficionados. So aside from the habitat that I talked about, the larger issues that are harder to address on the ground is, what's going on. So aerial insectivores are declining, and the one thing they have in common is that they eat insects. We really don't have a lot of data on insect population trends in North America. There's more data coming out of Europe, but even then, it's kind of sparse, and we haven't been able to draw any real conclusions or link it to aerial insectivores in any quantitative or qualitative way. One thing you may have noticed is that, windshield wiper fluid used to be for insects, and now it's pretty much for salt. I know, I'm old enough to notice that you really don't get many insect hits. They actually have a name. It's actually called the windshield effect. And it's something that scientists are talking about. Then there's the pesticides, insecticides that are in use now. I mean, neonicotinoids have been, indicated, have been shown to be reducing honeybee populations. But there's a woman at the University of Saskatchewan who's doing research on tree swallows and finding that these neonicotinoids, when they're systemic pesticides, so the plants they're applied and the plant takes them up and actually incorporates them so that anything feeding on the plant gets the pesticide and dies. But they really only, the application is really, it's inefficient. Like 5% of it goes into the plant, and the rest of it, you think, well, it must kill birds who eat something that has the pesticide on it. But much of it just flows into waterways, and she's finding that it's affecting the aquatic insects in waterways, so that tree swallows it's affecting the abundance and the diversity. And I think she's linked some tree swallow declines to, the location of some tree swallow colonies near areas where these pesticides are applied. She's found some connection between lower breeding success and the application of these neonicotinoids, I believe, or she's working on it. In any case, they do affect insects, not just not just the direct application, but by flowing into waterways. And these birds are they feed on aquatic, insects that hatch, that spend their larval stages in the water, like dipterans, flies. That's a large part of their diet. Another thing that affects swallows is, in terms of climate change, is extreme weather. So this is an example of how heat can affect swallows. These are barn swallows. These photos aren't actually totally related. The one in the basket was a woman contacted me and was very upset because her barn swallows jumped out of their nests because they were nesting in nests close to a tin ceiling in Georgia, and it got so hot they just bailed. And she put them in baskets and lowered them. But how many people are going to do that? I mean, I'm just thinking, this is a problem. Like I mentioned, I don't have swallows nesting, and I don't open the windows of my hayloft because it gets so hot up there in the upper hayloft. There's actually there's a study published by a woman named Tara Imlay in Canada. These swallow declines are worse the further northeast you go. So there's a lot of work being done on swallows in Canada. And she found in her study that cliff swallows were being affected by nesting below tin roofs up there because we get these hotter summers. Also, we get some, another thing with tree swallows, just to kind of give more of a broader view of how these birds are affected by non-habitat issues. Colder, we get some really severe cold snaps now in the spring, more frequently than we used to, because climate change isn't just global warming, it's temperature extremes. So tree swallows have been shown to be affected by that. The gruesome picture on the right, actually, I want everyone to know that chick survived. I know that. But this is just to show you, and I know there's someone watching who was there when I was cleaning this chick. You can see little dots on my fingers and on the bird's eyes. Those are mites. And I had a big problem with mites at my colony this year. And mites do really well in hot, humid weather. And all of my second brood barn swallow nests were infested so badly with mites that I would come up and the chicks would be on the ground. They actually get so uncomfortable, they just jump out of the nest before they're ready to fly. So me being me, I contacted someone who told me how to clean them. And I used alcohol. Different people have done different things and kind of wiped all the mites off of them. You can see some dead mites on their heads in the picture of them in my hand. And then these are they were getting their feathers styled and dried in this picture on the left. But actually, I'm happy to say all the ones that I treated made it. But again, how inefficient. And I'm like loath to use mite spray because I don't really want to use chemicals. So, it's just something to be aware of, how temperature affects, these birds. There's such complex things going on. I mean, the mites are natural, but at these levels, I just hadn't seen it before. This is just a nest that I also replaced all the mite infested nests with clay nests because there were so many mites in the nests. This is just, this is not like hard science. I'm just trying to do on the ground conservation and try to learn about how to help these swallows. So a little bit about bank swallows and conservation. So one important thing to think about with bank swallows, you tend to see them along, in riparian areas, tend to be along larger rivers because they're also colonial, like cliff swallows. So they'll like a big face where you'll get like hundreds or even 1,000 or even over 1,000 nests. And they also nest in gravel pits and road cuts. But really, those gravel pits and those road cuts are really temporary in the great scheme of things. A river meandering in its within its floodplain is long-term habitat. And what I was finding when I was doing my work on bank swallows was, farmers were losing land because the power company was using water in the Connecticut River and for a pump storage facility, and increased erosion in that pool, what they call between two dams. And so they did this whole, bioengineering project to stabilize the riverbank. And again, that might be nice habitat you see on the bottom right for another species of bird, but for the bank swallow, it's useless. So, I did see many large bank swallow colonies become stabilized. And that's not to say, I understand sometimes we do need to do projects like this, but calling, again, to look at balancing what we need versus what they need, so that some of this long-term riverine habitat remains. I know in Massachusetts we're ready for a good bank swallow survey, and I'm trying to get that going, a statewide bank swallow survey, because bank swallows are declining, I think, even more than faster than cliff and barn, and definitely faster than tree. Chimney, just to talk a little bit again about habitat versus these larger issues. So this is a chimney swift tower, and these are great, but what new research is showing is that a lot of these are put up and unused, because we just think about habitat, but there's other things affecting these birds. So there's a woman named Margaret Rubega at the University of Connecticut, I believe, who did some work in Connecticut and found that actually in a city that was pretty dense with nesting chimney swifts, about half of the chimneys, they surveyed the chimneys, and about half of the chimneys that were just like chimneys the birds were using were empty. So her conclusion was there's habitat that's not being used. So there's something else driving the decline. So it's not to say we shouldn't try to help by improving habitat, but there are larger issues at play now for aerial insectivores. And one interesting thing about the chimney swift that I wanted to share with you is that there's a guy, Joe Nocera, up in Ontario, who did this. He took like there was a old traditional chimney swifts roost in these giant groups. And there was like a cross section of guano from decades of roosting, and he analyzed it, and he found that the chimney swifts were feeding on beetles until DDT hit, and then they switched to true bugs. And then when DDT was banned, you'd think they'd go back to beetles, but they continued to eat true bugs. That's what showed in those layers. And so that's, these are little clues, like, is that something to do, does that have something to do with their decline? Is there, we have little clues, but we just don't have the answer to these aerial insectivore declines. So I wanted to end this with, because it's a little depressing. I don't want it to be. I've had really good luck with on the ground management techniques for cliff and barn swallows. And like with Logan and Glenn, I want to share those with them. And now that we've kind of learned what we need to do in terms of putting up nests and controlling house sparrows and not trying to attract them to sites where they've never nested, these are all really positive things that we needed to figure out. So I'm just going to close with a little video of the swallows at my place at the end of my breeding season. And you'll see there's tree swallows and there's barn swallows, just to have a little peaceful ending. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mara. That was an awesome presentation, and we have a bunch of questions here for you, so we can go through some of those, and some of them you'll have touched on, but we can reiterate, I'm sure. Let me get in here. Okay, so one of the first questions we had was, did you have any measures for productivity for cliff swallows at Patten Hill?
Did I actually like investigate nests and like, so when I didn't do anything in terms of banding. I don't know if that's a question. I don't band. The way I monitored my nests and decided they were successful versus not is that cliff swallows, when they get to be about 10 days old start begging at the entrance of the nest. And I would be up there every day and I would observe each nest, and I knew which nests were active. And then when the chicks got to be about, they fledge at about 23 days. And so I would see, and they also look, they get to be, they look a certain way right before they're ready to fledge. They look like the adults, except they're brown and speckled. And I know because of the timing. And then one day they'd all be gone and they weren't in the nest when I took the nest down at the end of the season, and I called that success.
Great. So there were some questions here. Let me see if I can wrangle all the ones that are related to monitoring the nest. Let's see. So what are the dimensions, the typical dimensions of the clay nests? I know they're fairly variable, but.
Yep. And interesting to note, at some sites there was one site in Rowe in particular, when I took the nest down, I think last year I must have made them a little taller than they liked. Every single nest had a dropped ceiling that they had put in there. So I would estimate about 5 inches high by about 6 inches wide is what I do. That would be the outside. So so smaller, like 4 by 4 inches tall by maybe 5 inches wide inside.
All right. Another question on dimensions. How wide an eave is needed over the artificial nests?
Yeah, good question. I've seen cliff swallow nests facing all 4 orientations. And so I assume the worst weather in our area comes from the west and the north, but I tend to just, different buildings have different overhangs, and you just want the eave to kind of be beyond the nest. Even if it's not a very steep overhang, if it's beyond the nest, that seems to make a good difference, if that makes sense, if it sticks out further than the nest does. And sometimes I'll put the nest lower or higher on the eave, depending on how steep that roof is. So it's a little hard to explain. I have a website. If anybody has specific questions, like down to some specific detail, they're welcome to contact me and I can try to help that way. But generally, you want the roof over, to be longer than where the nest ends.
All right, great. So a question on the swallow mites. So someone was wondering what the range of the swallow mites are and if they're as common in northern cooler climates.
That's a good question. I know for cliff swallows, the ectoparasite, that bed bug that I was showing you earlier, not the ones that were on the barn swallows, those are throughout the range. I have to say that the barn swallow mite issue is new to me, and I'm not sure. So that was something that I can't answer. I know they're specific to barn swallows, so my guess is that they are naturally occurring on barn swallows throughout their range. And my second guess would be, it's a really good question, because like southern populations of barn swallows, why, it's warmer down there, so would they have more? And I have to say the mite problem was new to me this year, so that's something I'll have to investigate. Don't know.
All right, great. So we had a couple questions on invasive species and some specifically for house sparrows. So we had a general question on commenting on the impact, if you could comment on the impact of invasive species on bird populations. And then we had a specific question of what are some measures people can take to control house sparrows. And I know you said people can reach out to you directly for that second question, but.
Yeah, it's really hard. House sparrows are hard to control. It's just a fact. There's ways I think you can kind of deter them from your own property. I know, so for example, they're really attracted to grain. So if you don't have a working farm, and you have some type of grain, or even if you have, I guess put it this way, if one thing you can do, I guess the first thing I would say is when you feed birds in the winter, don't feed mixed seed. If you have house sparrows, feed just the black oil seed or sunflower seed, because there are native birds that like the mixed seed, but they also do fine with like the sunflower seeds and the birds that the seeds that the chickadees and the titmice and birds that feed on the feeder drop. But house sparrows do really, they like mixed seed. Also, don't put up bird boxes, and then if you get a house sparrow, don't let it breed. So like take the nesting material out, and if it's consistently a problem, I would take the box down and move it. I just don't let them breed on your property. Don't feed mixed seed, don't have seed around, and this is not to say this will fix the problem, because lots of people do these kinds of things. And if they have a farm, if there's a neighboring farm, sparrows will keep coming in. But the house sparrow problem is a real problem, and it's hard to deal with. But the grain and not letting them nest is the first thing I would do. In terms of non-native species affecting birds in general, in my mind, house sparrows and starlings are the two non-native species that I encounter that can prevent other birds from nesting successfully. And I find house sparrows are much more of a problem. They can be a problem on bluebird trails. They'll take over bluebird boxes or tree swallow boxes. Starlings are more, I think people who try to attract kestrels to nest boxes sometimes have trouble with starlings. Starlings nest in like crevices in barns and buildings. So if you can figure out where these birds like to go. Oh, another big one is pigeons. I don't think they so much negatively impact other birds as much as people. They bother people because they'll go in your barn and create quite the mess. So I'm not an expert. There may be other invasive, non-native birds affecting bird species elsewhere, but to my knowledge, starlings, house sparrows, and pigeons are the three biggies.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Mara. One of the advantages of using the artificial cliff swallow nests is that you can take them down between seasons and sort of control them being used by house sparrows as winter roosting sites. Is that true?
Interestingly, I haven't seen them roosting in them in the winter. But the problem with house sparrows, again, is they're here, the cliff swallows show up in late April, early May, and the house sparrows are here all year. And they'll if you have the nests up before the swallows get back, house sparrows will claim them first. And again, I wouldn't have a problem personally if a house finches will do this. House finches will take one nest and nest in it and leave everybody else alone, and that's fine. But house sparrows defend, 5 to 10 nests on either side of their nests, and they do it very aggressively by pecking adults and young and tossing them out of nests. Like it sounds dramatic, and it really is awful. I mean, I do see this. You'll see pecked chicks on the ground. So that's the problem with them, is that they defend this huge area around their nest. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So you had a question about materials for making artificial shelves. Someone was wondering if cutting plastic bottles in half might suffice as a shelf for.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, if a nest has fallen, I've used all kinds of things. The only reason I feel like the clay is good is that it's breathable, and it looks like what they use naturally. So the parents are more likely, I suppose if you're using it as sort of a rescue to put up chicks back up in a fallen nest, it's better than nothing. For attracting them, I don't think it's the best. It really, I think what they see is something that looks like their nest. I've never tried putting up just, something different like plastic bottles or pieces of wood or anything. I haven't tried it. But the benefit of the clay is that it looks like what they use, and it's breathable, and it lasts for a long time. So I don't know. I doubt, I tend to doubt they would build onto a plastic bottle,
Hmm.
but you never know.
All right. And we had a question about cliff swallows out west. So they said, is it true that cliff swallows in the west are not having the same problems you describe? If that is correct, do you have any ideas why?
Yeah. So when I was talking about aerial insectivore declines, and these, you're seeing these numbers I'm putting up about half the number that we had in the 80s. We don't know why, but it's been documented that the decline in aerial insectivores, and I should say that aerial insectivores as a group are declining, but there are a lot of species in that group, and not all of them are declining. And for example, flycatchers, they're doing better than, say, nightjars, swallows, and swifts. And their decline is more patchily distributed throughout the continent, whereas we're seeing like this real, rather steep decline in the northeastern part of North America. So the decline is it follows a gradient northeast. Cliff swallows are actually doing fairly well in the south, and they are doing okay in the Midwest and West, but there have been some recent, recent documentation, like the past couple of years. I know this past season was a really bad season for cliff swallows because of some weather events in the Midwestern part of the country. So we're seeing some effects of weather there now too, but for sort of an overall broad decline in aerial insectivores, and cliff swallows are part of that group. It's the Northeast that shows the worst decline, and we don't know why.
Great. And we got one last question back on the topic of house sparrows. So the question is, weren't house sparrows abundant during the 70s to 90s when cliff swallows were at their modern peak? Why do you think they weren't such a problem then?
That's a really good question, but I don't, let's see. So house sparrows were brought here in the mid 1800s. I don't know if the numbers were as high as they are now, or if there were more colonies of cliff swallows, and maybe some weren't affected by house sparrows. I don't know. That's really actually a brilliant question that I have not thought about. I guess I assumed that the populations of house sparrows were lower at that point, that they hadn't spread. But really in the 70s, although, cliff swallows, actually, I think I might have the answer. Cliff swallows started slowly declining in the late 1800s. So it was slow, but it started in the late 1800s, which is not long after house sparrows showed up. So I think it's just that it hasn't been something that's been a sudden decline. It was just this long, slow loss of habitat, competition from house sparrows, and then we just started really noticing it in the 80s. But I think house sparrows probably started affecting them that early. It's just gotten more noticeable. I think that's the answer.
Great. And all right, we do have one more question, and it's, do we know anything about the wintering areas in relation to their breeding locations?
There's a lot of research that's been done on barn swallows, and I believe that I know that Western barn swallows have a different migratory path than Eastern barn swallows. And barn swallows have a much wider nest wintering area than cliff swallows. Cliff swallows are more concentrated. All the cliff swallows that nest in North America tend to be in Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay along river systems. That's been documented. So I think to sort of answer it broadly, cliff swallows have a more localized wintering area, and barn swallows are more spread out. And there are the east and west populations migrate differently, but I'm not an expert on the barn swallow wintering areas, so that might be something to look into. There's not been a lot of research done on these swallows in their wintering areas. Most all the research has been done in the breeding areas. So I always see that as an area that needs future research when I do like read the species account for the barn swallow and the cliff swallow. Says that like we just don't have a lot of data on, I know they're in large roosts, but just even the threats they face down there, we're not quite sure.
Great. Okay, so I am going to bring up that slide once more and just wrap up with folks. So thanks again, Mara, for that presentation. That was excellent. As a reminder, we are going to have this we're going to have this on the Maine Natural History Observatory's YouTube page. And just as a quick follow-up, we have several projects going. We've got our nest monitoring project, which we have boxes available for folks that are interested in monitoring tree swallows. We started that cliff swallow colony pilot project in partnership with Mara. She set us up with a number of artificial nests, and we still have some of those available. We want to get those out into the field for 2021. And the Maine Bird Atlas, we've got another 2 years of data collection that we're working on, and we really need folks out looking for cliff swallows, bank swallows, barn swallows, all of them. And there's lots of opportunities for people to collect those observations. So definitely want to direct you there. And also, I should have listed on here, Mara's site, I put it in the chat, is swallowconservation.org. I have that right, Mara?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. And
to answer questions, you can send me a question through that website. There's a place to submit a question. I would love to get swallow conservation stuff going in Maine. Like I said, I'm working with Pam Hunt I don't know if any of you know her, in New Hampshire, and with Drew Vitz here in Massachusetts. So if we could keep spreading the word, that would be great on getting some of these conservation projects going for these birds.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again. And we'll wrap up. And thanks again to everyone that participated today. And thanks again to you, Mara, for presenting tonight. It was great.
Thanks. It was fun. My first Zoom presentation of COVID.
Yeah, right. It was a success.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm going to close.
Take care, Logan.
Take care. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.